Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Back again with Josh Blank. Welcome back again. 2 weeks in a row. It's a little streak.
Yeah, I'm excited. Maybe we'll keep it going. I don't know.
It's a little streak.
I like when you have guests, though, because I don't have to do it.
Well, you know, everybody wins no matter what.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
This is not a zero-sum game that we're playing here.
Win, win, win. I'm almost sick of winning.
So are you? I was going to say, are you sick of winning yet?
Not yet.
Yeah. It's going to depend on how we.
Yeah, I was going to say
that retirement question we were discussing earlier. So we're here the morning after. Mm-hmm. It's Thursday morning. Last week we were recording as the House was considering the budget. That day they went till about 3 a.m. next morning, passed the budget. Today we record in the aftermath of the House debate and passage of HB2 and SB2, the school finance and school choice ESA bills, respectively. Both bills passed second reading in the House, with the House passing the ESA bill after a very extended debate. One for the books in the history of chubbing. So SB2 passed at about 2 a.m.
Right, with no Democratic amendments.
With no Democratic amendments and no Democratic votes,
right.
Interestingly enough. Let's talk a little bit about what these bills do. I mean, people kind of know what's going on here. But
yeah.
Just
highlights.
Yeah, some highlights.
Yeah, sure.
Some highlights.
So HB2, it's the big school finance bill out of the House. It's $7.7 billion, passed 144-4. I think the main thing that people are going to take from this is it increases what's called the basic allotment, which is sort of the
right.
floor amount of money that is given to each school district per student in that school. And again, when I say per student in that school, that's a little complicated, but let's just say
right.
that this is the base law.
An asterisk, a little cross, a couple of footnote numbers.
I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wingdings that come after that.
A lot of wingdings. Good.
Good reference for some people have to look that up maybe. But anyway, no, nobody's that young who listens to this. And just to be clear, that's, so it goes from $6,160 to $6,555. That's a $395 increase. Now, to be clear, the actual money that school districts receive per student is higher than that because they're federal funds. This is the base allotment. So if a student has, if they're low income, if they have extra, special education needs, which is a separate part, actually, there's more funding that goes into it.
Some of those dials got
tweaked around
as well without getting lost in the weeds.
But this is one of those things I think that, if you don't follow this debate closely, can seem a little bit confusing, which is, was it $10,000? Is it $6,000? Well, when you take everything, we take all the federal dollars, when you take the average, it's probably closer to about 10 is what we say, per student. When we set aside sort of the big spending, groups there. Also, some other highlights. I guess I should say most of that money, because it's in the basic allotment, has to go to teacher salaries. And that's important here because one of the things that they did early in the day yesterday was they flipped the order in which they were going to debate these bills. And we were talking about at the time. And part of this is there was a lot of grumbling after the end of last session that the House didn't at least vote on a school finance bill so that they could have increased teacher pay, or say they had voted to increase teacher pay before the death of the voucher bill and the death of all of it, essentially.
Right. And the politics around that were very fraught. And, that's one of the things that then Speaker Dade Phelan took some heat on.
Yeah, he took I would say a lot of heat on. I mean,
not just the failure of the voucher bill, which he took a lot of heat on, but also the fact that they would not move the teacher pay bill. And the read was that was, in a sense, to protect Governor Abbott. Yeah,
even people in the chamber Republicans in the chamber who did not necessarily care for or care much about the voucher bill would have preferred to have had the vote on the public ed funding last time before that. They didn't have it. Now, it's important to note, again, because it's the basic allotment, because of the way the law works, 40% of that allotment has to go to non-administrative staff salaries, which higher, pay increases reserved for teachers with more classroom experience, high-rated teachers, et cetera. There's going to be a lot of negotiations around this. The Senate approach to this is pretty different, I would say, at this point. It's really concentrating those salary increases solely in these sort of high-performing teachers, long-experienced teachers. The basic allotment gives the school districts a lot more flexibility. And if you were to go right now and Google search Texas ISD budget and shortfall, you'll find lots of articles of lots of places in the state, where you can see that this is an issue. And so I think the main thing about the House approach to this was they wanted to try to give the school districts a little bit more flexibility with the funds that they were going to inject.
And from a public opinion perspective, we've talked about it in here, and we don't have to roll out tons of data, but we know that increasing teacher pay polls well. And it polls well on a pretty bipartisan basis with the expected difference.
Yeah, there's less priority among Republicans, for teacher pay, and I think that tracks essentially lower evaluations of public schools in general among Republicans. But at the same time, it's pretty hard to find people who have negative views of teachers. It's pretty hard to find people who think teachers are getting paid too much. And so it's just one of those things that, and I also too, and this sort of speaks to the state's politics and a lot of them, elected officials in the last few sessions have expressed a certain degree of concern about the attitudes of teachers, especially the notion that teachers, district administrators, would mobilize in some sort of uniform way. And so, and not to say that this is just, whatever, rent seeking or whatever the fancy terms you want to use, distributive politics, blah, 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 blah. But there is a fact to this, which is just like they kind of need to address this.
Right.
The other issue that was also attached to this in this bill was limiting the use of educators who lack, formal classroom training. There's a huge increase in the number of uncertified teachers in Texas as the state has sort of loosened those laws to be able to deal with teacher shortages.
Right.
But then the unintended consequence has been, I would say the unintended consequence is leaving those laws in place, or that sort of loosening of the requirements has led to a lot of uncertified teachers. And so they're trying to claw that back.
And so, stepping back on the politics of this, just in a very general sense, I mean, in terms of doing the bill first yesterday and all of that, I mean, there's a sense here that this was going to be part of the ensemble all along.
Yeah.
Right? That there was going to be some more money for teachers, some more money for public ed. It was not going to be as much as Democrats wanted.
Yep.
Or the school advocates wanted, but it was enough that people were not going to say no to this.
Yeah.
And we saw that in the vote.
Yeah, and I'll just say, we're just going to set aside, is that $395 a lot, a little? I mean, there's a whole very interesting, I think, just a policy kind of timeline to all of this if people, want to look into around, what the state's been spending on public ed, what the localities have been spending on public ed, how it looks when you account for inflation, all these sorts of factors that are very interesting or part of the debates around these bills. But this is where we ended up.
And they go back to politics that stretch back a decade and a half, at least. I mean, in some ways you could say it's perpetual. But just the funding question still goes back to the cuts that were made in 2011. The first year, ironically, that Texas had to do a budget after the Great Recession without federal support making up shortfalls.
Right.
Just pause there for a moment.
Yeah.
And then the 2019 addition to the allotment, but that, caused a lot of argument, as you say, what is the baseline for what the student funding per pupil funding should look like?
Well, right. And also a lot of the 2019 stuff, and again, just to sort of, we're painting with a broad brush from 50,000 feet, but a lot of the 2019 efforts are really around property tax reduction.
Right.
So, I mean, it's one thing you get to say, hey, we put money into public ed. It's like, to do what? To lower people's property taxes.
Right.
So there's that.
So that passes, and that passed, with some debate, but comparatively easy. And then SB2 came up. That took much longer. In the end, I'm not sure how many of the amendments they actually heard, but, I was in the building for a while yesterday, and, what was going around as you were walking around, or you were in the gallery, or you were walking the halls, or going, talking to people, was like, hey, how many amendments are there now? Because there wasn't pre-filing.
Right.
There wasn't a pre-filing
you were looking yesterday.
In the rule, right? And so the amendments were just sort of popping up, and people were going from office to office, and I hear there's 40-something. Well, we're up to 50 now. Last I heard there was more than 60. I don't know how many got pulled in the end. My bad. I haven't gone and looked, but it lasted a while in there. And as we've seen, a lot of long pauses. pauses to negotiate, pauses for points of order, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, what do we get? We got $1 billion to create education savings accounts, in the form of vouchers that families can use to pay for private school tuition, other school-related expenses. The bill is going to tie the voucher programs per student dollars to public education funding. Tricky.
Yeah.
And, a lot of attempts to tweak that and amendments that failed. But in the long term, the amount available, what is critical to each participating student, is going to increase if public schools receive more funding, and they'll dip when public school funding declines.
Which, I say,
theoretically,
it doesn't really happen in real dollars very often.
Right.
Just to sort of throw that out there. But, interesting. I'm just going to say that. I thought that was one of the more interesting things that kind of came out of the House bill, because really a lot of maybe I should wait in terms of talking about some of the comparisons to the Senate bill, unless you want to talk
No,
now.
I think that's okay. Why don't you just jump into that? I think that's okay.
I thought that was one of the more kind of interesting decisions, I think, to make about it, because what you're essentially doing, I was wondering when they did that, whether it was an attempt to try to, I don't want to use buy, it's not the right word, but to try to garner more Democratic support. Because ultimately what you're essentially saying is that, if anybody down the line wants to increase the value of the voucher,
right,
you're going to actually have to increase the allotment to all public school students and all public schools. So now look, this doesn't mean that the program costs aren't going to grow dramatically, because you can have more students getting the same voucher, educational savings account.
Yes.
Whatever. Excuse me.
We're all adults here.
Excuse me. I've just been hearing anyway. But it does make it so that, like, if in a 5 years they say, well, it would be really great if the voucher was $12,000, or what is the average cost of a private school in Texas? Most likely it's going to go up over time. If that's the case and they want to move this up, then we say, well, okay, we really have to spend a lot of money on public education.
Yeah, and the LBB projections were that
it would be very expensive.
This could get very expensive. The interest of fairness, everybody kind of poo-pooed those projections. Not everybody, but the governor did.
And I'm just going to, I'm going to use a different word now that you've said that. I think that is unwise. Only because, not just because I think, the LBB generally, they're not right on everything. Nobody is. The economy is the economy. There's a bunch of inputs here that are clearly in flux. The problem is we can look at other states. We can look at other states that have done this, and in general, we do know what happens with programs with these kinds of provisions, and the way that it's set up, it should cost the state more over time. That's the goal. That's the other thing that's sort of odd about, why even lie? That's the goal. The goal is to grow it. The goal is to get people in it. It's not to make it this tiny thing. I think, so it's why not?
Yeah, the days were that, this is not a pilot program.
It's not even close. And that's and then the other differences I thought were a little bit more window dressing, to some extent, to my read, in terms of sort of, there's a lot of effort in the House to put more meat around the prioritizations.
Right.
Who is going to get access to the money first, second, third, and so on. The issue, of course, is that, essentially if the group that you prioritize doesn't fill up all the available slots, then their slots go to the next group, their slots go to the next group. And I think what a lot of people have raised is well, yeah, but if essentially, only, let's say, half the available slots to sort of these lower income groups, special ed groups, so on and so forth, get used, well, then they're just going to get used by high income groups.
Right, because if the $10,000 the basic, between $10,000 allocation doesn't cover enough of the tuition costs, and, the number being bandied around is the average private school tuition is, closer to 12. Mm-hmm. And I don't vouch for that number, but it's the one that was floating around. But that it makes it more likely that the lower income. Harold Dutton, and early on in the debate, had a line that got picked up in a couple of the stories. As soon as I heard it, I figured it would. Mm-hmm. Which is, if you're in a 12-foot, you've fallen into a 12-foot well, and somebody has only a 10-foot rope.
It's an okay one. We could work on that, but I like it.
It should be probably 10 and 15 or something. I'm a tall guy.
You could just jump.
If I fell on a wall, but they'd have to pull my big ass.
I don't want to see you fall anywhere. It scares me.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that.
Now, I will say they did do something. There was an amendment, right, that would cap essentially people without disabilities and family of four, sort of in a family of four making more than $156,000, which essentially become the cutoff line for higher income and not.
Right.
to only 20% of the program's total budget. And the 20% of cap was only supposed to apply through 26-27. Now it's supposed to apply through each year of the voucher program. I don't know if that escapes conference committee. And that's kind of, I think, maybe where we should there's some other requirements in the bill. I mean, I should just throw these out. We'll come to the conference committee next. So the bill would require private schools to have existed for at least 2 years. I think that's this notion that there's going to be fly-by-night schools that open up to grab a voucher. So at least
not in the beginning.
Not immediately. They have to at least have a couple students for years. I think one of the things that was a big piece of this that was really resisted last time in the House, and sort of I have a thought why, but it sort of almost seems crazy, is requiring the program to collect information on dropout, expulsion, graduation data, and also have it broken down by grade, age, sex, and race or ethnicity. There was a lot of resistance to that last time, which I gotta say didn't look good, in terms of the politics of it. And I think, if you want to say, does this process, it's funny. And you watch all this and, people want to complain about these process. Like, this is actually in some way a process working. I mean, in some ways it's not. But in terms of the legislative process iterating and kind of moving towards something.
It's the process working the way that one, more or less according to design, whether that's the process working well or not.
I didn't say that. I'm just saying it's working.
I'm elaborating here,
I'm just saying it's notable that this was a big issue last time, and they said, no, we'll put this in. Now, again, there's a conference committee. We'll see. And the extent to which people were resistant to collecting data on the program last time was weird. I mean, it was almost problematic.
Yeah, it was a little ugly.
Yes.
To my mind.
Obviously, the program's going to bar undocumented Texans from participating, as in any bill you can come up with this session.
And I would a little to add some color to that in a way. I watched a lot of this yesterday. Intermittently as I was trying to do the day job and other stuff. But we've talked a lot about. We had the piece that we put together a couple weeks ago about the slight adjustment in the temperature on immigration and border issues. Mm-hmm. The degree to which there was just an unending, it ended, an ample supply of amendments proposed, many of which passed that were aimed at ringing the poking at the immigration bear.
Yeah.
There was no opportunity left, untried to try to limit to flag that we don't want immigrants involved in any of this at all in both bills.
Yeah.
Right. But it came up a lot in the HB2 debate.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, part of it is that it's really, it's just become kind of like, I think it was a de rigueur or something. Is that what it is? To just basically add a provision to anything that says, and these services will not be given to undocumented immigrants, even though there's might be no evidence that it is, or it's not even a program that undocumented immigrants.
It doesn't make it. Yeah, it's something that's already illegal in federal law. Or
look, we'll just pulling back the curve, saying this is a bill or this is an amendment or whatever that a member puts up so they can go back to their primary audience. And I made sure that when it comes to gas subsidies for farm equipment, you can't be undocumented. You can't hire undocumented.
Right.
It's or whatever.
And there was a lot of that, and it's kind of a side observation, vibe observation but it did remind me of that gap we were talking about between, the continued, high level of agitation, activation over illegal immigration, quote unquote, although some of this was also about legal migrants, but, despite the fact that we see some attenuation and, or the ongoing limits on support for some of the specific things that the Trump administration is now doing in the presence of less traffic on the border.
Well, and in some ways, this is what, to the question of, how would the legislature pivot with a, very, very anti-immigration Republican president in the White House? And the answer is, well, we're not setting up, a new military force. We're not opening a bunch of new prisons for undocumented. We're just making sure that the state is not providing any services to anybody who might be, unqualified in some way.
Yeah.
Okay. So
unqualified in terms of national identity.
That's what I meant. I said, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I get it.
So, I think this kind of speaks to this whole thing. So we just kind of already mentioned this, but it's this sort of the interesting thing now. And we've talked about this a lot, sort of, I don't know, probably on the podcast, certainly personally, but it's like, okay, so the House has passed a bill, differs from the Senate version, and now it's going to go to conference committee. Now, I think, we've kind of said all along, it seems like, betting odds are if a bill could escape the House floor, get to conference committee, the conference committee can send something back. It's probably going to, the chances of it failing are slim to none, I think.
I think at this point.
I think there's questions about, and this is where I think to my mind, this is where I go, which is, how serious is the Senate's proposal? And I think and I mean that in a very serious way. I don't mean to say like question its seriousness, but because they were so quick to get it out, and it's not to say that they weren't working on the interim, like they've been working on this issue for years. So it's not like they, whatever, but they were quick to get it out, put a big dollar number on it, didn't put many restrictions, got it to the House. And the question is that a statement of their preferred program, or was that just to get something to them and a starting point of the negotiation?
Well, I think, yes, their preferred. How preferred? How strong is the preference?
Well,
right?
Maybe so.
I think, but
is there any way that a bill could come back that looks more like the Senate bill, or on certain lines along the Senate bill that the House says, I don't think so?
Yeah, and I think when you look at that vote and you look at the post hoc, only 2 Republicans voted against the bill.
Right.
And that would be, and they're both interesting cases. Representative Van Dever, already no vote, and Representative Phelan.
Right. Who did vote for the Democrats' amendment or effort to create a constitutional amendment.
Yes, and he was, I think
he's the only Republican
to
vote.
The only Republican vote on that. So let's talk a little bit about that, as a way of kind of transferring to like the big read of this and the politics.
Yeah, because it takes us out of it.
So the big story going into, yesterday was the fact that Democrats were floating a proposal which was ultimately put before the chamber in an amendment by James Tallarico early in the debate. I think it was Amendment 3 or 4 or something like that. That would have used a rarely used mechanism in the Texas Constitution, but one that is available and has been used before. And all this is, for those of you that follow this, is, a lot of coverage of this in the last 72 hours. That would have required voter approval, but not as a constitutional amendment. And the argument circulating was that this was, Democrats were going to use this as a way of, providing an alternative, and that the threat was that the Democrats will not support other constitutional amendments proposed that require a supermajority, that require 100 votes. That the Republicans don't have enough votes on their own to pass those. Now, that has failed.
So now
it was, and it was probably the highest joint level of substantive debate and heat.
Yeah.
In the debate that I saw, and I think the post hoc seems to agree with this, other than, the occasional personal spat, was over that.
Yeah. And I think the logic there is pretty clear for those who haven't thought about it a ton, which is that, if you put this out to a vote, one thing you're going to do is you're going to extend it. You're going to extend the debate. This is actually this is a great Schatzschneider moment. And I love Schatzschneider, which is an author. You can look it up. You can't spell it, but good luck. Semi-sovereign people. But this is an expansion of the conflict, right? In the chamber, the vote was what the vote was. It was kind of what people expected. But if you go and you say, well, what if we expand this discussion to anybody who might show up in a special election?
Right.
Different thing. Then you say, well, who shows up in special elections? Well, the issue is, in a lot of ways, Democrats have been turning out better in these random elections, number one. Number two, who would be mobilized to vote in an election like that? Teachers.
And there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them, and those are low turnout elections. So you would have really forced the voucher proponents to spend tons and tons of money. And I'm not sure that there would have been anything comparable on the other side, but this has been what's going on along. But the other side might have the numbers.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they do. They might have, and I think that was sort of
But when you're this close to passing the bill, there's no,
Yeah, well.
This was definitely a Hail Mary.
Well, and so now the Hail Mary is done. And so I think about,
bounced out of the end zone.
Right. And so, it was funny.
Uncaught.
So this actually connects to the voucher thing, which is to say, in a weird way, which I think, one of the things that Abbott did, obviously at the end of the last session, was he said, look, if you're not going to support my voucher bill, I'm coming after you. And then he made good. And I talked to a lot of reporters and said, look, if he didn't do that, what good is his threat?
Right.
He has to follow through. There has to be a cost. Otherwise, every time he tries to go to negotiate with them, they'll say, yes, so what?
Right.
Well, now the Democrats have made a threat. Do you think they're going to follow through on it now that it has not worked?
I have a hard time seeing enough Democrats. Now, they could surprise me.
Yeah, because they have to hold. I mean, you don't need all the Democrats.
And, we're not talking about, look, some of these constitutional amendments that are proposed, maybe you can obstruct that. But, are Democrats really going to hold up water?
Increasing the home. I mean, to me, the one thing, increasing the homestead exemption right there. So you guys, in a year like this, honestly, do you really want to have a vote not to raise the homestead exemption if that's what comes up?
I mean, it's going to be a very hard threat to deliver on, and in the end, may wind up just looking like a bluff, and
Yeah, I mean, luckily for them, it matters less because it's diffuse. In the sense whereas Abbott, he would be the one person who would bear the cost of not following through. Right. Here, it's kind of like, well, yeah, the Democrats didn't hold together. What else is new?
Right. Diffuse is a good way of putting that. So yeah, where does this leave the Democrats on this? I will tell you this, the mood in the place, is a vibe check, and this includes, I talked to Republicans and Democrats yesterday, including, members, staff, advocates, obviously very unscientific sample, but, pretty sour.
Yeah.
Pretty sour mood about where the whole enterprise is.
And what does that mean? What would you attribute that? Let me see. What they attribute that to, or you attribute it to? What do you?
I think it's different things for different people.
Mm-hmm.
I think for Democrats, it was a bad day yesterday.
Yeah.
Something they've been, obviously, that doesn't even require a lot of explication.
Yeah.
Right. Both in terms of the substance of the issue itself and the sense of, going through a lot of effort and a lot of trouble, being pretty sure, it's going to be a losing effort. Yeah. You can throw some points of order out there. You can try this.
It's going to be a long day for a crappy ending.
Yeah. And so, I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah.
And
that's true. So it's not even, in that case, it might not be the sample, but the timing of the sample too.
Yeah. And I don't think other days are particularly better for most of them, frankly. And so you can understand that. But I think, there's still some procedural discontent, I think, brewing out there about the process.
Okay.
That you pick up on, so, and this is on video. I'm not speaking out of school here, I don't think. At one point, as they were closing the debate on the Tallarico Amendment for the referendum, Representative Kane got very upset. He was sort of up there, it looked like he was getting ready to speak. And there are different contending interpretations of this.
Right. But
he got very upset, kind of threw his binder and his pen and stomped in a very angry way, and angry and visible way, and stomped away from the front mic. And so the reason I raise that now is not just that,
just for color.
Representative Kane is the, Rosetta Stone of the mood of the Republican caucus, I don't think he is.
No.
But the contending explanations for that, which are, well, he wasn't recognized and he was mad because he wasn't recognized. Mm-hmm. But it also looks like he might have been a little sort of elbowed aside in the speaking order and in addressing the merits, the lack of merits in this case of, as they saw it, of the referendum bill. That seemed to be a little bit more about intra-coalitional tension, shall we say.
Yeah.
He wanted to speak. The bill sponsor just kind of stepped up while he was queued up there and said, move to table, very summarily to kind of,
Which not, just say.
Which not
bill
unusual.
Author, committee chair.
And so, and look, it could be both, right? It could be some combination of both that, But anyway.
Well, it reminds
the reason I raised all that is just to close the point is that, when you talk to people about what happened there, I think the preferred interpretation among some people is, just more of this procedural stuff where, he should have been recognized and he wasn't.
Yeah.
That's a much more palatable explanation than, well, sometimes our guys just don't get along.
Yeah.
Right. And they could both be going on. But I mean, I think, there is still, the point being, in terms of my sourness, there's still some kind of lingering discontent over how the House is operating. And look, it's coming from a lot of Republicans who didn't vote for this particular speaker and, went in skeptical of the regime.
It reminds me of, we sort of mentioned this last week, but, you did that Pat panel.
Yeah.
And I think it was either Harvey Kronberg or Brad Johnson who made the point that sort of the Harrison, privilege speech kind of, or the motion to vacate the chair. He's saying, look, that was reflecting some reasonable issues that people are having about the pace in the House. And that's about management. But because of who did it, how he did it, all that, it really honestly, probably, was a net benefit to the leadership. Yes. But nonetheless,
this is a good follow-up on that point.
But nonetheless, it does raise the idea that this is sort of like a lot of things, even if you don't agree with the methods, even if you think the messaging is crazy, it doesn't mean there's not a kernel of truth lying out there somewhere. Right. And so that's sort of another point, in sort of, if we're looking at the scoreboard for the instances where that's out there, I'd also say, it's interesting to me, I guess, and that, you think about, Burroughs is the nature of the coalition that got him there and all of that stuff. But I also think about the timeline. And on the one hand, there's always people who are discontented with the process. There are always people who are discontented with, how much play they have in the process and all that and all that kind of stuff. And that's normal. But then if you think about it over the arc, I think, I'm just thinking about from the leadership position here too. It's like, the House doesn't have a lot of latitude, like I think this session in particular, right? The last couple sessions have been tough, to the extent that if you want to be a serious, hey, let's take the pressure off this a little bit and let out some of the steam so people can kind of have their moments and whatever. It's like, is this the session for that? Well, I think maybe once they get some more of this stuff done, maybe.
Yeah.
But I can see why they'd want to keep it a little bit tighter than it's been.
Yeah, and I think. And there even then
right,
even in response
to that, continue it.
Some of the people that were reformers would say, and they're not even doing a good job of that.
Yeah, sure.
Right. So given how long it took, here's a bill that everybody knew was going to pass. It took them all. And again, in retrospect, but I think it's good to connect that. I think, look, if you step back, however much some of this discontent is still out there simmering, perhaps having been reduced by the way things have gone. I think what you have to step back, to be fair, is say, look, this is a big win for Governor Abbott, for Lieutenant Governor, and it's a big win in political terms, for the big three. Just generally, when you can, because it benefits, whatever you think of the policy, it certainly benefits from comparison for how this all went last time. How all this went last time. And that's an obvious point, but I think it's easy to get kind of caught up in the vibe check and the minutia, and I'll step back and go, look, everyone is exiting the field for Easter weekend declaring victory. Yeah,
and let me take a step back even further. In the last 2 weeks, the House has voted to instruct the budget conferees to pay back Ken Paxton his back pay for the impeachment and pass a school voucher bill.
Yeah.
Whether or not you voted for Burroughs, whether or not you like the way that he's running the House as a Republican right now, those albatrosses, I guess you can put it, are gone, right?
Yeah.
For most people. And so that means you can move forward. And I said, everybody's talking about the timing and how long it's like, well, look, we're sitting here right now. That's pretty good, just from the political standpoint.
Yeah. The clock's not ticking on sine die.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's so I think you have to you have to recognize that. I don't want to sort of be talking about this and not recognize that that's the case, right? So, and then from a big policy perspective in the national politics, Texas now becomes the largest test state, at least by population, not by the amount of money being thrown at it
currently,
this point.
Yeah.
But, the largest test state to see who benefits from what is fairly understood, I think, is a new entitlement program.
Yeah.
And again, one of the themes that keeps emerging in line with what is going on in national politics. Donald Trump called and made a rambling call, which is out there on social media. I think Braddock, I think Scott Braddock first broke
Yeah.
it, but it's obviously somebody in the meeting was just taping it and sharing
to the
it.
GOP House caucus.
Yeah, the House caucus meeting before all this.
Is Dan there?
In which, Trump called in and gave a very Trumpy kind of thing. You can go listen to yourself.
A lot of reminders about how well he does in Texas.
Yeah.
He's won a lot.
He's won a lot here.
Hey.
It's true.
Yeah, okay.
Now, this came up during the debate. The timing and the context of this are not exactly fortuitous.
Mm-hmm.
Given all the uncertainty in the fiscal outlook, not surprisingly, mostly Democrats tried to raise this. There were a couple amendments about, contingencies for reductions in revenue or economic difficulties. Of course, none of that passed. It is interesting, I think, to step back and look at what now feels like the almost inevitable income given the meltdown of 2023.
Yeah.
The counter reaction from donors, from the governor, from the lieutenant governor during the 24 cycle.
Yep.
And I think last week, or, maybe it was last week, we were talking about the degree to which there was always everybody was kind of hedging, no, this is going to happen, but, it might not.
Might not.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
Nothing is 100%, and certainly in the process. And, but I think, the fact, we kind of started on this and then went to something else, but to go back to it be, the fact that only 2 Republicans voted against this is seems to me to be the completion
of the
of
arc.
a long cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's thinking, we're thinking a lot about our educational responsibilities.
Right.
There's a really good example in there, the arc of this
Yeah,
and how it played out in sort of policy and politics, right? I feel like I just snapped my fingers and it all just happened, but it's been a long time.
No, I mean, I think, that said, I mean, it's been a long first movie in the trilogy.
Yeah.
But, in terms of thinking about where we are physically, I would remind everybody that in those trilogies, it's almost, boilerplate that the middle movie of the trilogy is a bummer. Right?
Yeah.
The Two Towers was pretty bad, was pretty grim.
Yeah.
Empire Strikes Back, pretty grim.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think I haven't thought about this a lot, but it does sort of, you'd already brought up 2011, and I mean, it's sort of sitting out there kind of thinking about it, but it's around when I started sort of working with you full time in that range and stuff, and working on the polling stuff. And man, the extent to which those budget cuts to public ed dominated, a lot of conversation for years.
Yeah.
Years. And at least 2 to 3 sessions we're talking about the cuts they made, the $5 billion, right? Over and over and over again. And it's you're just looking ahead thinking, is that what we're looking for in 2027? I just
Yeah, no, I think, as I said, winter is coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll see if it's a lot of pop culture references.
Yeah, I was gonna
nerdy
say.
pop culture references today. If it's a 2-year or a 12-year winter.
Well, I was going to say all the schools there were private.
Yeah, there you go. A lot of homeschooling going on.
A lot of
in
homeschooling.
Game of Thrones. I think what's other than the Citadel. Anyway, but we digress. I want to check in on politics, but I think a little bit on electoral politics before we get out of here. But I do think that the good transition for that is to pause for a moment on what this means for Governor Abbott.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, a pretty big win for Governor Abbott.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I've been having these conversations.
Oh man, I know what you're going to say.
About whether Greg Abbott has national political ambitions or not. And it's hard not to look at this and think and wonder if in the mind of Governor Abbott and his supporters and advisors, you had, obviously the win that we've talked about on the podcast a lot in various ways, and recently with Abbott standing in the national Republican arena as a result of Operation Lone Star and the busing and, his work on the immigration area.
His profile is much higher nationally than it was.
During the Trump interregnum, if you will. So does vouchers become his No Child Left Behind?
Oh, good.
I'm going to regret saying that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I already regret you saying it.
But, That's
should-
that's how people are going to be thinking.
No, and it's interesting.
with Donald Trump calling in and saying, "Hey, I'm really behind this."
Well, look, I'll say this. You be out up front here. I mean, I think you and I have generally been pretty negative.
Yes.
In terms of
the reality
of Governor Abbott running for president. We've made this point many times that no politician will ever bat away speculation like that. There's just no point. There's just no good reason. And especially for a fundraiser like Abbott, and especially in a state where you can fundraise pretty much in an unlimited way, if people think this guy might be running for president and he might, be one of the early potential frontrunners, that's just even more money for his state campaigns or whatever. I will say, I mean, the way you laid that out, it does probably increase, my probability meter a little bit on that one. Like my priors are updated, as we would say, a little bit.
I'll tell you what it really updates my meter on, though, is people talking about it.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I think what it does raise is, something I said, to you about, sort of the tariff stuff and some of this other stuff going on is, Trump is not going to have to face the voters for any of this. But Republican members, Republican senators, will. And maybe it'll work out for them, maybe it won't, but ultimately they're going to own this. The other piece of that, though, also is that, assuming normal constitutional order and elections and all that kind of stuff, which I do, there's going to be a gap. I mean, there's going to be a huge gap at the top of sort of the Republican Party. People say, well, it's J.D. Vance. Well, maybe. I mean, I don't know. How's that worked out for other former vice presidents so far? I mean, it depends. And we'll see if he's the guy. We'll see if he comes out of this in that kind of position. They tried to hang the last guy. So it just depends. And so, I mean, when you think about it that way and say, well, who? And you say
they being their own voters.
Yes. Well, that's exactly. But I mean, I'd also say this, sitting from where I am in Texas, if I were going to say, is somebody from Texas is most likely to, who from Texas is most likely to be the next Republican nominee for president? It's Ted Cruz, not Greg Abbott.
Right.
And I think Ted Cruz is definitely still interested.
Well, I mean, in terms of, thinking about some of the leading indicators on, I mean, he's already carefully hedged a little bit on the tariffs for Trump. Yeah,
he's positioning himself. I mean, I'll just say, we've already talked about this, but he's, I think, in a position to sort of be the return to the traditional Republican category or the real conservative or whatever. We've gotten away from our foundations or whatever, if that's where it goes.
Well, what's interesting about that is that it's kind of a return to, I mean, because, you say that and I'm thinking, well, that doesn't quite work for Ted Cruz. I mean, it'd be more like if all of a sudden John Cornyn had a renaissance.
No, it's not. It's not a renaissance for Cruz. He's saying it's time for the party to come back.
Yeah, but I mean, the coming back. I mean, at what beginning point? And this is, right? I mean,
oh, sure.
Because this isn't Ted Cruz going up. Look, these tariffs are bad. What we need is a return to Bush Republicanism.
No, I think it's more.
That's all I'm kind of responding to.
No, it's post Tea Party. I mean,
that's exactly right.
It's post Tea Party Republicanism. It's when Ted Cruz came in. But
weren't you happier in 2013?
Yeah, life was so much better. But the thing is, Ted Cruz of 2013, 2014, Ted Cruz of the Tea Party, that guy still came through like Federalist Society channels. That guy was still. It was like he went to Harvard Law School, guys. Like, I mean, he's still part of that ecosystem that has existed for a long time in conservative circles. And so, he's not John Cornyn by any stretch. They're very different politicians, different eras, all that kind of stuff. But it is like, it's not a return to 1980. It's a return to 2013 or whatever. Yeah.
So speaking of John Cornyn.
Yes.
So lots of other things have been happening since we left in terms of electoral. Mm-hmm. So, Paxton had just gotten in last week, or had announced he was going to get in last week.
Yeah, I think we talked about that a little bit.
And we did. So, that race is very active, obviously, and going to take a lot more shape. Interestingly, and this brings us back to Donald Trump again to something. The lieutenant governor decided to announce that he intended to run for re-election, or reiterate that, and to also announce at the same moment that he had the endorsement of President Trump.
Yeah. And I mean, this is like, this is where political science is kind of useful in some cases. Just like, look, one of the things about Patrick is that he has ruled the Senate with an iron fist. They've given him a lot of power. And, I think what most senators know is that if they oppose him on a priority, or even if they really deviate from the form of the method that he would prefer for that priority, they might be punished.
They're at risk.
They're at risk of punishment. And what does punishment look like? Just for those, bad committee assignments, your bills don't get referred, you essentially are in the penalty box, and there's not much for you to do besides vote yes on the things that the lieutenant governor wants you to vote yes on until you get moved back into good graces. Right. Well, what if he's not running next time? The threat doesn't, I mean, there's actually a good theme for this podcast, but the threat, doesn't hold the same water. If he can't punish you next time with committee assignments because he's not going to be here, well, then maybe you don't need to do this. So that's why, I mean, to me, like, there was something very just, I don't know. It's just sort of, it's like the universe working as it should. It's like, yes, so he's announcing re-election. He's going to run for re-election. I'm going to say he could change his mind.
Right.
But for right now, and it was very clear in the press release too. He's like, look, I'm going to have a formal announcement,
the
big
deadline
thing.
for the paperwork is December.
It's December. We're going to have a formal announcement after the session. But you know what? There's still a bunch of time left. And I just want to make sure everybody knows. Yes. And now I don't want to make sure everybody knows. I want to make sure, I've got a great endorsement just to kick it off. You know him. I know him. Donald Trump, everybody.
Right.
And I would say, that's also smart from Patrick's part, because I'm going to say right now, just looking at what we're looking at, I think the value of Donald Trump's endorsement is probably going to decline a little bit. But for Patrick, you get to, if there's any field that would potentially emerge, because there's a lot of people looking around right now, you clear it. You say, look, I'm running again. I've got Trump's endorsement. I've got the money. I've got the position. And I don't think anybody, I mean, there'll be a challenger, like some names.
Right.
But is somebody going to spend a bunch of money trying to knock off Dan Patrick from that seat? No. The other thing that came to my mind was with all the movement that's going on now, right? And we'll jump to the Attorney General's race in a second. But with Paxton moving out of the AG's office, with Hager moving on to Texas A&M, one of the things is going to be a pretty active primary season. And at the top of the ticket in Texas, we know that Cornyn is planning to go pretty negative on Paxton. I assume Paxton will do the same. And if that sets the tone and you're going to have that going through all races, I was just thinking to myself, Patrick really has a commitment to like the Republican Party, all this, like within the state, there is a service aspect to the party to just stay in so as not to make it even more of a mess, because look, it's going to be a tougher year. You got a Republican in the White House, and then you're going to have a bunch of Republican candidates for these statewide offices who've just eviscerated each other.
Right.
Which then the Democrats, they can put in their own ads. So I think there's a lot of reasons that this makes sense at this point in time right now.
Well, and I would also, yes, and I think it's a really astute point that, it's going to be an ugly primary season. We know it's going to be an ugly primary season because the tone is going to be set at the top, and with these other openings, AG and controller, of course, there's going to be some pretty bloody primaries. And remember something, to go back to the voucher bill for the ESA voucher bill for a beat. The thing that makes it not a voucher in the ESA is that it's going to be operated by, wait for it, the controller's office.
Yep.
But we're not going to have Glenn Hager in charge anymore. That's a big unknown quantity. So in terms of all this election stuff, I think that's exactly right. It makes sense for Patrick to do this, whatever his plans are. And then you start getting into all these like, okay, so he runs.
Yep.
He gets reelected. Then he gets to do what we've always assumed he wanted to do, which is put his thumb more heavily on the scale of who runs for his to replace him, and gets to play that, engage in those maneuvers of favoritism among the senators.
Yep.
Right. And some of the senators that I think would, at least one or two, that would be in the running for that or going to be interested in that seat are up this time.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? I mean, one of the people that will be on the ballot, for example, is Brian Hughes. So with Middleton in the race for AG, or a lot of speculation around Brian Hughes gets much more interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
What he is going to do. And also would also note that, Middleton was up this year. So that's going to be another.
Just to make this clear, I mean, everybody who's listening to this should know this, but the way this works is that in Texas, if you're not up for election as a legislator, you can run for another office without giving up your seat.
Hang on to your seat.
So that's why it's a freebie. You can, as we say, you get to run. If you lose, you just go back to being a state senator.
So, with Middleton in the race, I think it's going to be very interesting. Tons of speculation about who else is interested in that race, and we'll,
And there is another person in the race, John Bash, who was
who was also very.
He was the first person to announce. He was I think he was a U.S. district attorney. He was, I think, Elon Musk's personal lawyer at a certain point.
Yeah, he was federal attorney.
Federal attorney. So he entered the race.
Musk. He's done, a lot of.
He entered the race first. I don't want to say, Middleton is going to be tough because he can spend a lot of money. I mean, just
But if this guy gets, if the other,
John Bash.
yeah, Bash can get endorsed by Trump.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And
Whether that happens or not.
Middleton's rise has been, expensive and meteoric, and so it sort of seems I wouldn't be surprised, but we have to see who else jumps in.
And
I guess.
he has a lot of resources.
He has a lot of
He has
resources.
a lot of resources to bring to the table.
So
I think, what do we do? All of that is going to continue to develop. We're going to keep an eye on that. But I think as we see what the legislature is doing kind of shape up and what people are going to be able to run on, it's going to make the last couple of months of this very interesting, particularly with Middleton now explicitly in the race, still in the Senate, other people kind of eyeballing that seat. I mean, there are other people in the Senate that have been thought about as interested in that seat. And,
in the House, you mean? Or?
And some of them are not on the ballot.
Do you mean in the AG?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, for the AG race.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, on that, any final thoughts?
I'll just add, before the debate this week, we wrote up a blog post, again, just sort of trying to put all the sort of public education, ESA voucher attitudes into some sort of context. Not a lot of, we've gone over this stuff a lot in the podcast, in other posts, but we wanted to put the most recent data in one place. That's on our front page. That's on the polling page. We'll link to it in the blog post for this podcast. But if you want to go and look at some of that data, again, we sort of really try to summarize real quick. What are the main points and takeaways for public opinion
there's not
on
a lot.
vouchers?
There's not a lot of pondering of it, but there's a lot of context for that, and we'll re-promote that again when after the conference committee is meeting when this comes back. But that's again texaspolitics.utexas.edu, and as Josh says, right on the front page. Josh, thanks.
Yeah, it was a good time
as always. And
I'll come back. If you invite me next week, I'll come back for 3 in a row. But if you don't, that's okay.
Well,
we'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see.
I've got a couple of invitations out there hanging that I don't want to mention in case
I appreciate. I thought you were going to say we'll see what the listening stats.
Yeah.
Like.
I'm not just saying I'm going to better deal you, but there are some other commitments that are out floating around out there.
No, I like it.
So thanks to Josh. Thanks to our excellent audio production team in the Dev Studio of the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. And, of course, thanks to you for listening. Stay well out there, get some sleep, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast from the Texas Politics Project. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.